Hi, Shiva.
Hey, Jason. We just wait for 3 pass. That's always been the case where let everyone come in and then we'll get started.
Yeah, I'm ready. Are you in the States now?
Yes, in Phoenix.
Phoenix, that's right. We'll see you in what, Dallas on Friday. You guys just flying straight from Phoenix or?
Yep.
Just making the rounds, I guess.
Yes.
Were you guys like normally gonna be over like in Tampa, Clearwater, but the hurricane kind of changed those plans or?
No, we had a couple of events, so we basically just came for those events, and then
Hey, Raleigh, how are you?
Hey, hi Jason, I'm good. Thank you. How are you?
Okay. I know, can't thank you enough for being, such a rock star with us.
Thank you for that.
yep, Jason, I think we can get started. It's 3 pass, so as the folks join, it's perfect. So good morning, everyone. So as part of the thing that we talked about a few weeks back, last week we basically talked about what new features we are going to be putting into the platform, and basically the team is working on it. What we're going to do today is basically go through the what we called as the True Security series, and I'm happy to have Jason Whitehurst, who's basically going to be front-ending a lot of the content over here. And today, what we're going to talk about is unraveling what is zero trust security that everybody talks about, not from a marketing and a sales perspective, but more from a perspective of us understanding and basically also garnering your views on what you think the whole piece is. We would like this to be like a back and forth conversation rather than just that we're using the slides as a starting point, but it is primarily to basically make sure that all of us are on the same plane when everybody talks to us about zero trust security, because right now it's become a big jargon and everybody is using it left, right, and center. And it is not what we're trying to say is that zero trust is not a product. It is not a single product. It's not something. It's basically a way in which you implement a policy and then basically get that enforced so that you can be secure. So with that introduction, I'll hand it off to Jason. So Jason, thank you for doing this, and let's get started.
Yeah, if you could let me share my screen, we'll be all set. It just says disable, host disable participant screen sharing. So as soon as that's disabled, I can do my thing. There we go. How about- Got it. Thank you, sir. Let's see, we'll probably do desktop too. Let's see how this works for everybody. So, I appreciate everybody taking the time to sit down and talk about zero trust. Shiva, really takes this community seriously, and it's amazing the number of improvements and platform discussions and industry changes and things that he and Shri and Rushrali and the team has in mind. And I would say, I think if I could say it in one sentence, it would be they're about 2 steps ahead of even where I thought they would be as it relates to platform development. So Shiva mentioned talking about zero trust because he felt like, and I agreed wholeheartedly, that there's a lot of confusion around zero trust. I listened to a podcast recently from Sands about zero trust, and then I listened to another podcast, from another security researcher about zero trust, and then I listened to another one by one of the top security people in the world. And he called it the fallacy of zero trust. And one of the challenges he made in the conference that he was speaking at, which was a Black Hat conference, was find 2 vendors who had identified zero trust exactly the same in the conference. And of course, the joke is you don't. So somebody made a comment that said, zero trust, trying to get back to the comment, zero trust has replaced if I'm not mistaken, next gen firewalls, or something along those lines is kind of the jargon. I don't see that screen right now, but that is 100% accurate. And obviously when we look at next gen firewalls, there's been 4 or 5 iterations of next gen firewall. So I'm going to give you guys some ideas on the foundation, architecture, and implementation of zero trust. This is a fairly deep dive. It's meant to engender and create further conversation, fine-tuning, analysis, and implementation for the MSP, right? So, as an owner of an MSSP, we see platform after platform after platform that we look at and review. We review 4 or 5 platforms a month in depth to see whether they add to the stack in there. And when you look at zero trust, they're so wide ranging in what they determine zero trust to be that it's hard to quantify that for your client, hard to quantify that in an SOW, and making sure that your MSA covers the work you're doing within the confines of that infrastructure. So when we look at zero trust, the baseline understanding of zero trust is you're removing implicit trust. We are removing and actualizing MFA or some other security platform or protocol that deals with decisioning, administrative moves and changes, authentication into multiple platforms, whether those platforms are on premise for your client or whether they're hosted. And in particular, the tool sets that you use to in turn work with your client. We do a number of ransomware cases, and the ones that are the most difficult to deal with and absorb is when the MSP has been compromised, and that compromise then extends beyond to their clients. And we had another one very recently where that happened, and it's just painful to watch. So when we talk about foundations, we're talking about removing implicit trust and moving security from the network to the users, the applications, and the workload. If we all talk about where security was, even 5 or 6 years ago, it was the gateway security, the boundary. What did the firewall have? Was it Fortinet or, was it Palo Alto? And, was its AI engine more capable? Was its IPS more powerful and capable? And what other tool sets did we implement with that? As an, Cisco AnyConnect is an example of a platform that's under continuous attack, and we've seen a number of compromises around the implementation of that platform ineffectually. And so we're always kind of moving the game. This is my comment here, and this kind of came from an analysis from SANS or from Black Hat, one of the Black Hat presenters, and internally what we do in SIM and SOC is that monitoring AI efforts. Where are you spending your money, your resources, and your time on monitoring? It's no longer about what comes in the network, right? Because in Zero Trust, we're not as concerned about that. It's what leaves. It's what data leaves. It's what administrative functions leave. It's the logging that happens on the exit phase of an action. And that's much more critical now when you move the security layer to the users, the applications, and the workload. And so, I have a question, for everybody, and that is, why do you think this happened? Why do you think this part happened? And, I don't know if you just want to unmute and speak up or add a chat message. We're working through the workflow and how these things work. Maybe Sheree or Shiva, maybe you can read if somebody has a comment there, because I can't see them.
Yeah, Dennis says, I think verified trust is a better term. Some level of trust is required for any application to function. The issue is whether and how we trust, whether the trust has been verified. And the Adam basically says, because users cause over 80% of the breaches that occur.
Right. And the big reason that happened had to do with the shifting of users, pre, and post-COVID, where organizations who had never historically had anybody work from home decided that those folks were going to continue to work from home because they were able to deal with the security they needed for remote users. And what organizations are doing, if you're an MSP, it's a good attack vector, is these organizations are, spending significantly less in corporate real estate, and they're leveraging about 20 to 30% of that budget to IT and cybersecurity to manage what now is, a bunch of disparate users. And as we're seeing, BYOD is just becoming, more and more of a visible managed endpoint or resource within a client base, and all the liability and things that come along with that, basically saying, hey, I'm now protecting, your personal endpoint. And what does that really mean for the organization? So as you're thinking about your infrastructures, you're thinking about Zero Trust, we're dealing with, dealing with tracking what leaves and being able to store that data kind of ad infinitum in your environment. 30-day storage is really kind of no longer enough, for environment. So when we look at the principles of Zero Trust, again, this is core principles of how Zero Trust operates. First we have to ensure that all the resources are dealt with securely, regardless of location. The easiest way to do that, right, is a Zero Trust platform. There are a number of vendors out there. Some I like better than others for different reasons, but you've got Perimeter 81, you've got Total, Palo Alto's got a platform, then there's other vendors that are out there that also have a platform, and their underlying pretext is everybody lives in a Zero Trust, quote unquote, bubble, where traffic outside of that trusted, environment, that trusted, always on VPN, is ignored. And so it's irrelevant to you and irrelevant to the client because they're inside this bubble. So like let's take Perimeter 81, for example. If they're logged into Perimeter 81, they get a public IP assigned to everybody in that organization, and you lock down access to as many applications as you can just to that public IP. That's the much easier way to do it than more of an enterprise scale, which is adopting least privilege strategy, and trying to strictly enforce that with access controls like within Office 365, Azure, Azure AD, or whatever directory structure you use in Jump Cloud for that matter. So then we ensure all the components such as APIs for events and data exchange. The number one risk vector right now that we see for MSPs and platform providers, what do you guys think that is? And it's a relatively new arena for scanning and security. Does anybody have a guess? Yeah, and that's going to be API security, API scanning and API risk validation. That's becoming a big concern based upon some of the compromises that we've seen. Dennis said, I think verified trust is a better term. Some level of trust is required for an application to function. The issue is whether and how the trust has been verified. Excellent point. I like that a lot. So when we talk about, we talk about automation, automate those actions across the environments and your systems, driven by your context. Now that automation can be done in something like Process Street. There's some automation that can be done in Cyber CNS, and that will continue to functions of that will continue to be added. And when you look at our clients, every single one of our clients use Cyber CNS with every one of their clients. And that's just because the baseline footprint that we get is a byproduct of all the scans, the job reports, the no auth and auth scans are a big deal. For us as a security provider to verify the baseline of security, are we doing a good job? Are we patching? Is the infrastructure secure? Forget about process. So then we deliver that tactical and that strategic value. I put on the side here, one way to do this is always on VPN. Avoid the all-in solutions, adopt the core principles. There are a lot of always on VPN providers, zero trust providers are all in, right? They got antivirus, they got SIM, they got SOC, they got double fillet fish, they got it all. The problem with environments like that, and I've been a customer of environments like that, a large customer, is the problem with the baseline security recommendation is layered security, right? Layered security, layered vendors, no single risk footprint. That creates problems for a multitude of reasons. We had a SentinelOne outage yesterday for an hour because one of their updates went bogus, but we didn't lose protection because of layered security. So that's a little bit of an example. So we come back to the working definition, and we talk about what is zero trust. It's defined as an integrated security platform. Obviously, that's a multitude of tools. I know we all wish there was one tool we could use for that, but it relates to contextual identity verification. So if you've got MFA and you're using SAML and you're using something other than TOTP or rotating codes, and then you've got what would effectually be determined as that identity management. And Duo is probably the most popular platform from that. We use OneLogin, but tomato, they all kind of do those products all kind of do the same thing. And they're moving over to what's called PAM and privileged access management. We can talk about that as a topic. Again, if you have questions, thoughts, comments, dump them in the chat up there, and we'll get to them. This is a community discussion more than a platform presentation. Okay, what just happened? All right, how about a staff to keep rule? So when we talk about zero trust, it shifts security from this ineffective perimeter-centric model, obviously because everybody's working from home. We're talking about a lot of cloud systems and cloud security. We have API risks. We have, implied risk when we deal with authentication in platforms that don't necessarily support advanced MFA. SAML, as an example. And so, I don't know why my screen keeps doing this. I'm not touching anything. But, we talk about zero trust, shifting it to the user, shifting it to the application, and shifting it to the interface. Interface being your API connection, or however it is you effectuate the connection to the services that you use. So I asked this question a little earlier, and I should have waited till now, but what's the main driver for that? And that is people being spread everywhere, right? We can't lock them down in an office and provide that level of security. So when we talk about what are the platform requirements, what does this mean? This is more of an in-depth discussion of core pieces that can be managed through single applications or an application model. But every data plane communication must be encrypted at rest and in transit. That's a baseline requirement. Any data that moves within the confines of the applications that you are using or that your client is using should be encrypted. Now, if they have a DVR and they're not encrypting that traffic in transit, then you do your best to control it. But, wherever you can, that traffic needs to be encrypted in transit and at rest. We need to be able to have forcible access controls for every resource. As an example, you have an RMM platform, and that platform can take care of usually Active Directory updates, but the tech logs into the domain controller as a domain admin to make those changes, which is a less secure functionality unless there's a full MFA in play. Whereas doing it through the RMM platform, ensures the security of the environment, and the service on the domain controller is able to effectuate that change. Now it's tied back to the user in RMM, not necessarily in your contextual logs for your Active Directory. Your data, the protection for your data resources should be able to understand what those policies are. What does that mean? That means integration, whether it's by API or deep integration between your MDR, your XDR, and your SIM, SOC. Those of you that don't know what that is, security incident event monitoring, SOAR, security orchestration, automation, and response. That's the next iteration of SIM. And that data being fed in real time, and that data being able to be contextualized instead of just sitting there as a log. The policies must support securing all users in whatever location they are. And those controls need to be consistent across all the users. Again, how the heck do we do that? Well, you've got PAM, or privileged access management. Again, you have, an always on VPN solution where the user's encapsulated within a private network, and that private network, access to the applications are locked down to users who have already authenticated into said platform. We get a lot of challenges from clients saying, I don't want my people having to do 6 different steps or having to deal with the complexity and the additional steps that are involved. And that's why we use PAM, right? Where the user logs into the platform, and then when they jump to another app, because they're already authenticated, and they can jump right into that application if it's integrated appropriately. Now, when we talk about devices, they need to be inspected for their security posture and configuration. You look at always on VPN solution, like let's say Perimeter 81, right? I'm just mentioning them because we use them, not for any other reason, but they've got a pre-check when everybody connects to their platform. It looks to see if they're running the XDR or the MDR the MSP is chosen. It can look for registry keys to show the RMM agents running. It can do pre-check validation before the user's allowed to connect. And so that would be, prior and during configuration. You have to be able to distinguish your BYOD from your corporate devices. We all know how to do that. And access to your network resources should be dealt with explicit grants, not inherited security. And that can be difficult, right? You have 10 techs and 100 clients. And so what happens, right? Yeah, do I have to have a unique credential for every tech, for every client? That's the goal. And how do we manage that? And there are some ways that you can do that. Access controls have to be able to distinguish between services and what the risks are for those services, HTTPS, SSH, FTP, RD web, they go on and on. The metadata that comes from the network traffic outbound, you can do inbound too, but outbound's the key, must be logged and enriched. What does enrich mean? Well, when you look at the latest MITRE Ingenuity Carnabag Fin7 ransomware tests, there are different fields of identification. Telemetry is the highest field of identification in those tests, meaning we know who did it, when they did it, how they did it, where it came from. And so that's what we mean by being able to have enriched metadata. That's being able to look at who, what, where, when, and how within a period of time to determine whether there's a risk of play. Your network traffic, obviously continually being scanned, however you choose to do that. Your platform scanning, cyber CNS's remediation plan is probably the best thing I've seen invented in a long time, because it consolidates all that risk into one place, and you can tell your techs, hey, you're not working a ticket, you need to be working this page. And so that's been a huge benefit, and is a part of validating the core environment security. If you move stuff into the cloud, make sure that you've got the right access policies. Also, make sure your MSA and the liability reductions, liability limits built in your MSA cover the cloud services that you use and define them explicitly. And then, because if not, then you're operating outside the bounds of the MSA, and that can get risky quick. When we talk about automation tools like, again, Process Street or your RMM automating script deployment and patching, those need to be, obviously you can't do MFA with that. So when we talk about identity centric, we're talking about how those service accounts are managed, rotated, identified, and used. And, you need to have as many log sources as you can. Again, you keep hearing log, and that's because forensics is a whole lot easier when you have log data. So we're going to talk a little bit about the architecture of it. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts or anything they want to add?
Jason, there's one question that I constantly keep battling about, right? Like if you look at maybe 7-8 years before, there was a concept which was basically introduced, which is called NAC, right? And the whole NAC piece then extended into a certain form of policy enforcement. Like as a NAC, essentially when people logged in, I plugged in their computer, I could check the posture, and based on the posture, I could essentially either allow them or not allow them into the network, and then authenticate them using their Active Directory at the layer 2 level. Now, I think a common thought process that everybody has is we had NAC, now we are calling something called zero trust, right? And one of the things which I want to understand from most people is because I've seen implementations of the NAC in the enterprise, but I don't see them in the MSP space. Is there any specific reason why the MSP space did not ever adopt the whole NAC paradigm? Because it would have been a lot more easier, right, for enforcing security and making things work.
Yeah, it comes down to two things: monetization and how do we monetize a, NAC-based platform. Are you doing it per executed cycle, or are you doing it per, are you effectuating that per user, per platform, per server, and monetizing that, in a way that was easy to manage, has been an issue. And then you have players out there, like Threat Locker, who, is what it is, right? But you have the platform and their response is, you're not using Threat Locker, so you want your client to get ransomware, and that is by itself not enough to solve the problem. There's a reason why enterprise is not doing what they're doing. And so, we have to be cautious of that language and terminology that's used of saying, we're ransomware proof, or, you use our, application zero trust control, and, ring fencing and, other tool sets, and you're fully protected, you're safe, you're good to go, right? That's not the case. Nobody is fully protected all the time. And that's why we have layered security, right? So that we have the ability to identify and effectuate control. One of the real benefits in zero trust is if you can work with a vendor that is giving you a SOC service with it, is a strong value proposition. I don't care if you go with us or you go with Blackpoint Cyber or any of the other vendors out there that provide a SOC along with your your security platform, not just XDR security or MDR security, like a SentinelOne Vigilance or something. I'm talking about, a SOC that is able to use a SIM to aggregate all of that risk data and look for identifications of risk. What do we mean by identifications of risk? Well, I'll use a quick example and move on. Let's say you got a 16-year-old son, he gets up at 6 o'clock in the morning instead of you having to wake him up for school. Okay, that in and of itself is not something to be interested in. But then he takes a shower in the morning and, comes out looking really nice and dressed up and all of that. And so that's another indicator of something that's going on. And then asked to take your car, to school for the day without explaining what's going on. Point being, those three things in and of themselves independently don't necessarily present a risk vector or a substantive change. Looking at all three of them together absolutely does. And that's the whole premise behind what we're talking about. So Forest Wave came out with kind of this zero trust extended model. This has been around for a little while, but we see automation and orchestration, that's SOAR, right? That's the next iteration of SIM. When we use that, that simply means that there's really tight integration, with the platforms that you use, or our SOAR platform has really tight integration with Cyber CNS and other platforms, and that's just required of a SOAR platform to be able to do its job. And that's kind of the ring around everything. And then you have your visibility and analytics. That's the human capital part of securing your environment in a zero trust world. Human capital requirements will not change. They will continue to be a significant requirement because there are decisions that have to be made that AI and machine learning simply are not positioned to do right now. What do I mean by that? Well, if you are your RMM, say is in Central and you're using their remote access tool, and then all of a sudden, we see LogMeIn or something on a machine, the SOC will report that because that's an anomaly. However, that product in and of itself isn't a risk. The installation on a machine isn't necessarily a risk. And so the human capital, the human visibility into what's going on is what's meant by visibility and analytics, right? And then you have your workload and your people and your networks all revolve around, and your data is really what you're protecting. But what's the closest pieces that touch that data that can effectuate change, and that is people. So, this is kind of a funny diagram talking about impacted entities. It's basically everything. Okay. One of the big challenges we see right now, when we talk about zero trust, is the last 4 ransomware cases we have dealt with Internet of Things, IoT, compromised DVRs, compromised iDRACs, using IPv6 and NetBT to hide under the radar of scanning tools. Real-time scanning tools for real-time risk, and being able to exfiltrate a significant amount of data before the customer knew it. And that's because the average threat without a SOAR platform with a SOC is 43 days. That's the average, what we call dwell time, or time that that threat resides in the network. And so when we say everything's a part of that zero trust protection, obviously there's even physical security pieces that relates, to that. So this is what we call privilege access management. First of all, one of the things we do is we define the roles. So if we can talk about it at a base level, what's the first thing we have to do for the customer, right? The customer needs to define the roles that are present for security boundaries. Now, that's not your job to do that. That's the customer's job. That's a business decision. Again, this is just my opinion, so take it as you will. But it's a business's job to identify those boundaries and those boundary roles, and the boundaries and the roles come out of those boundaries, and access rights come out of said boundaries as well. And so we then take those roles, we create boundaries around those roles, and then we limit access based upon that. And the access enforcement, auditing your policies on a regular basis. How do you do that? Well, if you can, use a SOC to do that. If not, then you train some of your people to do that, or you work with an MSSP. We have a comment here that says John Strand refers to overlapping fields of visibility, which I think is a good way to think about layered security. Every product has blind spots, overlapping fields of visibility is the only way to cover them. Exactly right. That's what we mean by layered cybersecurity, layer platforms, disconnected vendors who have, who are not a part of one platform, but that you can use with layered security to be able to forensically or just plain technically address problems as they exist. We start talking about highly sensitive assets lately. We've been dealing with security layering for finance, HR, and leadership for companies because of the ridiculous amount of business email compromises that have picked up since Russia-Ukraine started. So now we're talking about even further segmenting email security and control by the roles that people have within said organization. And so what does that mean? Well, we may use a product like, Checkpoint Harmony, and the enforcement policies would be broken down by role. There'd be some significant enforcement controls for the higher risk people in finance and HR. So it's hard to do that with executives, but you try where you can. Again, it comes back to logging all your actions, everything that happens, log, right? If you're going to work with a SOAR, you're going to work with a SOC platform, make sure they have unlimited log retention. If they don't, walk away. You've got to have that data for longer than 30, 60, or 90 days to be able to create baselines and to be able to, deal with a potential compromise and be able to short cycle what's called an IOC analysis, right? If you have an indicator of compromise and you want to deal with that from an analysis standpoint, and you have the data that goes back months where it allows us to analyze that person's behavior or that platform's behavior and look for differentiation that happened recently based upon baseline behavior, that makes it very possible for us to, or whoever, to simplify the resolution. If we don't have that data, then we have to assume a bunch of things that can create problems. This is kind of suppliers and third-party access. We deal with a lot of this in MSPs right now, where you have suppliers that control some of your environment, right? One of the biggest compromises that happened was with Home Depot, right? How did these threat actors get into their credit card scanning machines? The initial entry point was through their air conditioning vendor contractor, who had a unencrypted VPN connection into these locations to control the AC environment, the AC management, and they had compromised that vendor and then got into Home Depot. And the dwell time on that was over a year because of how they operated. So dealing with zero trust as it relates to implicit or explicit trust or explicit, decisioning is incredibly hard to do. It's very time consuming. And so if you're looking at net margin for products, particularly these products that, are application whitelisting and, we got all these controls and nothing can happen. Well, those, the time it takes to manage these platforms and to manage them effectively, to test them and to determine whether that's the right risk footprint or not, can make, if you're the providing it, you're upside down in your margin because you're having to manage this platform, and it's taking, a significant amount of time and energy to do it. It's always difficult, but we want to look at what, as you're talking about leveraging these platforms, we want to look at what's our margin, what's our hit to margin, what's our cost of management, the fully burdened hourly rate of your tech, multiplied by the number of hours spent managing said platform, right? And then you subtract that from your margin for said product, you're likely to be upside down. And a number of security products, unless you got a lot of endpoints, or you're working with somebody to help kind of control that, like a SOC. So now we're going to talk about, operational technology. We start talking about how if you're dealing with critical infrastructure, right? I don't know how many of you guys deal with critical infrastructure, but power plants, water treatment plants, municipal electric providers. We had a ransomware case 2 weeks ago for a municipal or water treatment facility where the threat actors had, used IoT control to navigate to their DVR, and the DVR bridged the VLANs between production and their PLC network, just out of laziness. I don't know, maybe the tech didn't know how to make that, to get the camera feeds, but not be on the VLAN that the PLCs are on. And so that's kind of how they navigated. And so that's what we talk about when you've got critical controls where you can't monitor them. You can't put an MDR agent. So what do? Right? Well, there's a couple of ways to do that. You can pick those devices up in Cyber CNS, and you can begin to fill data in or extrapolate that data to RMM or PSA if that's where you manage it, and be able to manage those devices. Sentinel-1 Ranger is an IoT identification and risk analysis platform that works with Sentinel-1, and there's no additional agent to do that. So there's other ways to do that. And we really like Sentinel-1 in combination with Cyber CNS. That's been a really strong platform. And so biometric authentication instead of passwords, YubiKeys, any type of biometric. With Apple, it's going to be, fingerprint, control, Face ID. So being able to deal with biometric control and accessing your secure PLC networks, DMZs, if you can get away with it, don't have one. If you have to have one, well, then, you do it. But, you make sure that you got the right security layered in that DMZ, like a WAF, like a web application firewall. And there are a number of those out there. This working from home model is obviously the most popular model. When we deal with role identification, what do? Right, we identify the roles not necessarily as they fit the organization, okay, but we also look at roles in the risk vector that they have and where they live and how they work. So if we have employees in Dakar, in India or in Dakar, or we have people in Saudi Arabia, and we're a U.S. company, we have to have significant security controls around those geographic differences. Not because we expect any more attack in those countries, simply because the number of hops and boundaries we have to pass to get back home. And so we do that geographically. We can do that through geofencing. If you're not doing geofencing right now and you can do it in your client firewall, highly recommended, right? They don't work, if they don't work with a company in Madagascar, block it. Obviously some of these attackers come in through kind of US IP addresses, but geo control does help quite a bit. we want to ensure that the rights and access controls are even more controlled. The user is going to want to use their home devices at home. That BYOD pricing and risk is something that you want to pay attention to. Make sure your MSA, your master service agreement, right, covers the technical effort and the protection of a personally owned device. That is a different risk vector than a corporate owned device. Obviously, these models work with like CISOs, like we're a virtual CISO. So it would work with people that have that skill set that are only worried about those controls. We've been through the operational technology, the work from home model. Again, you have your always on VPN solutions. You've got your traditional SSL VPN solutions, site to site, full tunnel VPN. That type of technology can help ensure, those controls. Again, if you have a lot of that going on, it's highly, highly likely that you're going to want a SOAR platform with, significant log retention periods, so that analytic data can be looked at if, for some reason, forensics effort needs to take place, or even just a simple SOC effort to look at, certain log behaviors. This is Nist Zero Trust Baseline Model. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. It's just important to understand where policy is and where your policy enforcement is and where the security is, right? So by default, it's saying that, the system is untrusted until the policy enforcement looks at the behavior, and is that behavior within its policy control? If it is, then it's a trusted environment and it reaches that enterprise resource. What is that policy enforcement point? What is that also known as? Anybody want to take a guess? Yeah, it's also known as always on VPN, or ZTNA, Zero Trust Network Access. So now we talk about the threats, the subversion of your zero trust architecture, not necessarily in the implementation of it, but in the decisioning process. Right people, right roles, right time. Termination of employee, immediate dealing with that, the move ads and changes that deal with those controls. And also making sure that the applications and resources that people use. Here's another prime example. What do companies' marketing people do? They go sign up for some marketing CRM or, some marketing plan, and then all of a sudden your DMARC is screwed up, your SPF record's missing something, and it's like, what in the world's going on, right? So it's that kind of stuff you have to control as well, which is culture. Denial of service, we seeing what we call micro DDoS attacks. What does that mean? Well, an organization gets hit with 500 to 1,000 unique public IPs, every minute. And those IPs aren't necessarily good or bad, but what happens is the firewall itself is trying to deal with that IPS traffic, and it can't route layer 3 effectively because the CPU utilization is so high within IPS. We've seen that 3 or 4 times in the last 6 months. Nobody's claiming ownership of it. Nobody says, yeah, I did it. I don't know why it's happening, and I don't know who's doing it, but it does significantly impact the business. Insider threat is always going to be a risk. We can talk about that at another time if that's important for you. We have proprietary data formats or solutions. Again, it comes down to where that data is stored and what happens to it when it's at rest. Using something like OneDrive or using something like SharePoint. If they're a government contractor, you got to put them in the right cloud, right? So there's certain pieces of that to be careful. So I'm going to kind of jump across the threat map here. You can look at it when we share the slides if you'd like. So then we talk about implementation and a zero trust. Again, it's one of those things where it's in the journey, not the win. You're not going to be there tomorrow or the next day or the next month, right? The other part of zero trust implementation is being able to provide the right cybersecurity products as they exist based upon the risk vector that's present today, right? That's the key. What is that risk vector that you're seeing right now that are most pertinent to your clients and cause the most problems? You know, we were talking about back in the day, we had NAC. Yep, that's exactly what Shiva was talking about. And NAP, and they've evolved into zero trust and always on VPN. Yeah, and easier to manage. You know, when a developer can create a switch with code, you have all kinds of options, right? And so that's kind of where we stand right now in kind of the, you know, the cybersecurity of data flow, or, you know, securing data flow when we have virtual switches and virtual hardware, and how that data is managed. Every client's going to have a unique journey. It's what we call an a la carte platform. And, you know, common implementations, right? You've got your framework and your roadmap. Kind of hard to do sometimes with your clients. The best way to deal with that, you know, is to, you know, deal with an insurance questionnaire, try to help them with that. Again, never answer the questionnaire for them. Never, ever, ever do that. Give them the information saying, here is the infrastructure, here's your environment in response to the questions that you asked at this point in time. Leave it at that. Let them fill in the answers. That is a business process. And again, if it's not mentioned in your MSA, you're taking great risk. You know, and I can tell you cases where, you know, the MSP is protecting the client. The client gets compromised. They call the insurance company for cybersecurity, you know, policy. The insurance company looks at the questions they answered when they were enforced or when the policy went into enforcement. They look at the environment at play. If something's missing, if a question was misanswered, misleading the client. There was a big case that happened with this recently, where they said, yeah, we have MFA, but they didn't. The insurance company can rightfully refuse to pay and cancel the policy. So then what happens is the customer sues the MSP saying, you answered all the questions. It's not, we're not IT people. It's not our fault, right? So you got to be super careful with that. So that's why we have questionnaire in there. You know, we've already talked about kind of zero trust strategy. How do we implement it? What do we do with it? Capacity. Can we do it? Or do I have the right, as an MSP, do I have the right MSSP partnership, or do I have the right platforms internally, if you have security people, to be able to effectuate a zero trust, you know, capability, right? One of the things you absolutely want to stay away from is saying, hey, you know, we're a cybersecurity expert, we solve all your problems, or, you know, we're your one-stop shop. If you don't have vetted cybersecurity people on staff, that's a really dangerous process to take. So you got to make sure if you're going to market to that, or you're going to say that's what you can do, you have to have the right zero trust capability. And that's technical capability, not platform capability. The technology shift and change and move, as we already talked about, and the feature set built within zero trust, and what do those feature sets do for you? Like we talked about with Perimeter 81, again, it's just what we use, so it's what I know. You know, they have an agentless way to connect to certain services for people using their own device. You know, and then of course they have posture check of devices before they connect. So those are the feature sets, DNS security, that gives you, you know, significantly better security control. When we talk about, you know, these assessments that you can do, you can pick these slides up at, you know, when we get done with the presentation, you can look at the workflow of the assessments if you're doing an individual assessment. A lot of this data can come from Cyber CNS, but some of it's change management. You know, that's going to have to come from physical interviews of the clients. The question is, do we do that? Well, it works in a sales scenario. So we talk about current trends. Shiva, you want to cover the current trends, and then I'll pick up from there, because I know you've been staying on top of those. Or do you want me to do it?
We can run through these things. So most of the current trends that you essentially see is that people talking about users, service, network access, everybody right now is just talking about multi-factor authentication, SAML, and then I just saw a very interesting post today morning saying that 2-factor is dead and now it's 3-factor. So I don't know like how many factors it is, and I think multi-factor covers it. But essentially MFA is touted as the way to basically prevent yourself from getting hacked. But what we're seeing is more and more instances where this also can be broken. And a classic example of this is basically using eSIMs, which essentially have replaced the normal SIMs because of its convenience. But with every convenience also comes the typical problem. But the ability of folks to be able to give some kind of a hardware dongle, which essentially does the authentication, always seems to solve this problem and keep it as a most secure solution. So that's something that everybody is basically slowly beginning to do. And I know a lot of our partners basically use like Duo and other pieces, which basically are in that particular space. Then the second one is Zero Trust Network Access, which is essentially the newer name for what we are calling NAC earlier. So when you come in, do you trust the MAC? And if you trust the MAC, then log in using the authentication for that particular MAC. That essentially is what Zero Trust Network Access is all about. And third is software-defined perimeter, which is basically more talking about you define a perimeter using the software. That is, there is no defined earlier the perimeter was basically where the firewall was, right? Now you can essentially define the perimeter anywhere, and then that perimeter can be for certain applications. An application can have a perimeter which is basically within the organization, between the intranet, but basically not at the internet. So you can define variable perimeters, and that is essentially another thread that is essentially being looked at in terms of network design and basically how you can essentially run this. And this becomes easy once your network is basically being run using software, because what happens is that you have policy enforcement points that can enforce policy at any layer in the network. Earlier, you would have manually done this. Once you implement what is called policy decision points and policy enforcement points, you have much more control because you can centrally deploy these policies. This CASB is something that I think a lot of you are already using, which is basically a single portal access to all cloud applications. There are quite a few like SkyHigh and others who are there. But essentially, this gives you a single mechanism by which you can log into all the cloud portal applications. While it's a single point of access, how do you integrate that with all the other things that you're doing basically becomes a challenge. So that's where essentially we've seen CASB kind of wane in and out of like popularity. It was very popular 4 years ago, and suddenly it's waned in popularity in the last 2 years. And then now people are trying to see how to basically make this better. So the last one is basically, can you get Zero Trust as a service? Unfortunately, no, because we believe that, see, you can essentially get all the help you want to implement Zero Trust, but I don't think you can essentially say, I will take it as a service basically in the cloud, just like you're taking, for example, cloud-based services, etc. This basically deals with multiple things, right? Like users, people, everything. So essentially, you cannot really basically outsource this to someone. It has to be something that, as an organization, you help people move towards that, you follow it, and you help your clients follow this.
Yeah, 100%. What he was talking about with, Zero Trust as a service. You're gonna find people in the MSP space that offer that. Look at the data around Zero Trust as a service. Ask them to define exactly what that means. But those providers that are selling Zero Trust as a service, particularly all in, is a pretty risky, model for the MSP, not necessarily for the client. So what is missing? Right now, the current major risk vector is API security. There are a number of API scanning engines that are trying to hit the market and make it affordable. WallArm, I believe, is one of them. If you know Felicia King, she has done what in the world? She's done a lot with these tool sets, and so she might be able to give you some advice. We're right exactly at the top of the hour. I usually like to finish early and answer any questions. I will hang out a little bit more in case anybody has any questions or thoughts. I appreciate everybody's time, the depth at which we've gone into this particular presentation and the ones that will come subsequent to this on topics that Shiva picks, or that I pick when working together, will be more in depth. And that is hopefully generates questions, generates additional conversations, generates recommendations, and does what's most critical, which is empower the MSP owner to make an informed decision. Shiva, I'll give it back to you to close. Appreciate you giving me the time to chat today.
I just want to thank everyone who came in today, and basically hope this was a useful session. So we will basically share the slides with everyone. But as I said, thank you all for participating. And our goal is essentially kind of to have this kind of technical discussion, and not just something which is basically very broad-based and saying you shall, thou shall get hacked. But thank you very much for to everyone for coming over and basically attending the session.
Thanks, everybody.